Welcome to episode 1, Projects in Focus. This is a discussion where we will shine a light on the completed projects across Australia, and with the help of a guest, we'll unpack the lessons learned within the stage of a project lifecycle. Across the episodes, we'll cover projects from initiation through to closeout. We'll explore how things unfold and what we can take forward. Because in project management, hindsight is 20/20 and is often the key to better foresight. In our first episode, we turned our attention to the initiation phase of one of West Australia's most iconic infrastructure projects, Fiona Stanley. In this case study, it has rich insight into early decision-making, stakeholder alignment, and strategic clarity. This was one of my first ever case studies to review in 2013, and it's fantastic that I can now bring it to this forum for its discussion and learning opportunities. To guide us through this conversation, we've been joined by Professor Brad Carey, a respected academic and program management consultant whose career spans sustainability, infrastructure, education, and more. I first met Brad in 2016 when I finished my master's in PM at Curtin, and have always admired how he drives opportunities for his students' learning and career opportunities. His passion for empowering people through technology and education makes him the perfect guest to kick off our series today. Brad Carey, welcome to Projects in Focus.
Thanks for having me, Reece. Glad to be here today and talk through such a rich case study, particularly if you're talking about the initiation phase of a project.
Thank you. My first question for you today is, why is it important for project managers to actually understand the full life cycle of a project?
Look, it's important to emphasize an understanding of the life cycle of a project because the activities you do throughout the life cycle are different. I'm sure if you look back on your project management education, probably one of the things that was emphasized to you was early on in the project, you have to have that leadership focus. It's, figuring out, do the right thing, right? So making the right decisions that are going to put the project on track to be a successful project, right? So it's selecting the right project, even in that initiation phase. At the start of a project, before a project initiation, you can go one of a million different directions, right? Because if we're talking about solving a problem or exploiting an opportunity, where do projects come from? There's a million different ways to solve a problem or to exploit an opportunity. So during the initiation phase, you need to get that right. You need to select the right project. So it's to do the right thing. As you move into the planning phase and the execution phase, as a project manager, you're going to be doing more administrative type tasks, following up on people, did you make this deadline, cost controls, those kinds of things. You're really doing, making sure the thing is done right at that point rather than, selecting the right thing to do. So early on, leadership focus, do the right thing. Later on in the project, it's really about doing the things right.
Absolutely agree. The key thing about life cycle is that we are essentially passing on projects to other people, and those key handover points from initiation to planning to delivery, monitoring, controlling, and then closing, they're not necessarily always done by the same people. So understanding what you do in one stage is definitely has a direct influence on what happens in the next and following stages. Is a key, absolutely agree that it's a key reason why people should be aware of the full life cycle and not just a snippet of one. Have you had any direct experiences across a full life cycle that you'd be able to talk about today?
Yeah, look, particularly in the industry I come from, which is construction, you usually come on board after the project's been initiated. There's already been design work usually. Even in cases of early contractor involvement, most of the decisions around the design have already been made and you're coming in to kind of verify those. So as a builder, no, I was never involved in the full life cycle projects. Luckily for me, I was able to have a chance to be a part of a consulting group early on in my career, where we were client-side consultants for project management and procurement. And during that phase of my life or my career, I got to see a lot of projects and see them through from initiation all the way through to completion. One that stands out to me is one of my first projects. It was a public ice skating rink in a place called Roseville, Minnesota.
Oh, wow.
And basically, at the time, geothermal was a new technology. And they were looking to invest in geothermal to obviously lower the operational costs for the ice rink over its life cycle. Now, obviously, it being a novel technology, and this is kind of at the time, probably 2000, I want to say 4 or 5, when people started planning for how the asset was going to be used once it was constructed. Because before that, a lot of construction projects and infrastructure projects, it was, we had the team that built it. And as soon as they build it, they're done with it. And, they wash their hands of the project, and not a lot of consideration given to the asset management and how that asset would be operated moving forward. So in this case, the Roseville, Minnesota ice skating rink, the public ice skating rink, I got to see it, from the initial kind of ideas of, well, we need to redo the ice rink. It's costing us too much money. There were all these issues, and kind of see how, the project team came together, and that project manager who had the vision and said, well, we want this to be an asset that's going to last. We don't want to have to do this again for a long time. We don't have a ton of money as a city. This is a big investment for us. We're going to get it right. And that project manager set the vision. That vision, led to the decisions around using geothermal and, this new technology, and really, putting the project in motion, selecting the right contractors and engineers to be involved with it. And, over the life cycle, you can see that early vision carried through into the execution, planning and execution of the project, and where, it really built having everybody involved from the beginning, identifying the team, the engineers, the builders, bringing them together during that initiation phase. So they were helping to select the project, and then having those same people committed to the project throughout the planning and execution really gave me that first full picture of the life cycle of a project, and really seeing how if you bring the stakeholders in early when you're selecting the project, how much benefit that can have, not only through to the end of the project, but then when that, project's product goes into its life cycle as an asset. So, I have been able to do that, and it really changed my view on how important project selection and initiation is.
Yeah, agree. And I've been lucky enough to do something similar within the Public Transport Authority here in WA. And I agree, while it was a smaller project, bus infrastructure is not as big as an ice ring. But the public infrastructure, when you become a project manager in that space, you actually do get to see where it starts, where the planning gets done, and how it integrates into the larger operational elements across the transport infrastructure, how to build it, how to control during the delivery stage, and then closing it out and demonstrating the benefits from that infrastructure, the return on the investment, and all those elements that went back into justifying why we spent that money in the first place. Some people call it an audit trail. I call it actually benefits realization, actually demonstrating that this project was worth doing. And that unique view of the life cycle is something that project managers should be seeking on all levels of their professional career. But yeah, in general, like when we talk about the life cycle and what we're here to talk about today, we're actually here to talk about that first initiation. And you're talking about a project manager having a clear vision. How important is this first stage of the project lifecycle, the initiation stage, when you've seen so many case studies? But in your view, how important is it to you?
I think it's absolutely critical. If you don't get things right from the start, if you don't, select the optimal solution to the problem you're facing, or, the opportunity that you're seeking, if you don't select the right thing, you're not going to have as good of results. So having the right people in the room, so to speak, the stakeholders of the project early on when you're selecting the project, it's super important in that they have their say, but also, if you have blind spots, they can help you out with that. And most of us come from a very narrow background where we have, some technical expertise in one thing, but maybe not another. And having the right people in the room to help you shape that project before you go all in and say, that's the project we're doing. And then you try and do the old, square peg into a round hole. I'm going to pound this project in and make it work. Selecting the right project. I used to have a boss that talked about it, and the word he always used was alignment. You got to align the project to the situation. You have to align the individuals to the project. So if you get that, alignment correct from the beginning, where you align the project with the situation, you're far more likely to be successful by selecting the right project. So initiation, it's absolutely critical to get right at that stage.
I agree. And, this is the stage in the life cycle that essentially is the most utilized in my view as well, because there's so many projects that have an initiation that they just don't move into the next stage. So being, I completely agree, that alignment, that usefulness of determining what this project needs to return / be or, create are very critical elements that need to be identified. What are some key, documents or tools that are available to the project management in this initiation stage?
Yeah, look, it's the business case or project charter. It goes by 1,000 different names. Requirements brief. It depends on the industry you're in, right? IT is going to use different slang than construction is going to use, but really that document that shows it's got the feasibility analysis has been done. It feeds into that document, and that's your document that approves the project and says, here's the path we're going. And, kind of contains that information on what's the background of the project, why are we doing it, what are some of the key deliverables, the functional requirements, and then really importantly, what are the benefits we're seeking out of this project, right? Because at this stage, we might select an approach to the project, but we should have identified what the benefits we want out, or value. I guess if you go by PMI now, we're moving away from benefits to value. What's the value that this is going to bring? So really establishing that and having that in the business case or the project charter. There's a list of tools you can use. They vary from industry to industry, but I would say the important aspects or elements that you need is you need to capture the decision-making process. Why did we eliminate that option? Why did we go this direction, right? And really be able to justify why this is the best project and why are we settling on this for our business case. So that happens earlier on before you actually go to initiate and approve the project, move into the execution stage. Depending on the industry, let's say mining or oil and gas, they do a great job of this. Reason being is the investment there is massive. If you're going to go, open up a new mine site, all the logistics that go into it and the infrastructure that you have to do, they have time to spend in getting this right. If you move more into, smaller scale social projects or education projects, or sometimes even small scale IT projects, this phase is rushed. It's people looking for a solution. It can be underdone and underbaked. They don't really even consider alternatives up front. It's just, hey, this is what we're doing. Let's go. While it can be successful, it tends to lead to situations where as you're going through the project and you're planning, you're making up for that lack of investment in the initiation phase. And I think today's case study that we're going to look at talks a bit to that in terms of the rushed planning.
No, I completely agree. Where the initiation stage is definitely rushed and taken to with let's just get this out of the way so we can get to site. And I think that comes from a feeling of that initiation does not feel like there's progress being made to a project while going through the fundamental elements of what initiation is meant to create into the project. The initiation, from my perspective, is the DNA of the project that then is built out from. The key thing that I think that happens quite a lot is that progress feeling that people have. Just it doesn't feel like progress is being made. Like if you had someone on site starting building, that really does feel like progress. But finishing a business case and submitting it, most people are like, just let's get it out of here. Not necessarily feeling like that. That's actually progress towards the end of a project. So yeah, that's I completely resonate with what you're saying, and I add that little tweak in there just to that feeling of progress. So in terms of our case study today, Fiona Stanley, this is a case study that's being used throughout universities quite a lot. What does it mean to you? What does using Fiona Stanley's as a case study that you've seen through your courses at Code?
Yeah, look, it's a great case study in that it has all the elements. You can use it for talking about cost planning. You can use it for talking about scope planning. You can use it for talking about stakeholder management with students. So it has, a rich amount of inputs into this case study that really make it great for studying across the project management curriculum. Anytime you have a really large government infrastructure project, it takes on a political nature. You have promises made by politicians, which puts pressure on the project. They want to see results because, they're tying it to an election announcement or something along those lines. And that's where things get exciting. So that pressure, really is felt across this project, the Fiona Stanley Hospital project. In that, there were some early announcements made around, what would be involved with the project, the size, the scope. But they're probably made too early before all the stakeholders were involved with the project at the right levels for planning and input.
That's fantastic. So, in terms of the context, of the Fiona Stanley, for some of those that potentially listening or seeing us here that aren't aware of what Fiona Stanley Hospital is, we have, I guess, a list of criteria that it ended up. But what was this meant to be when it was first being talked about? In terms of the case study, what do you understand of what this was meant to be?
Yeah, so the government made a big announcement. Obviously, Perth was growing quite rapidly early on in the 2000s. There was the Reid report, which was a government-funded report into health. That had some recommendations, and based off of that Reid report, there was pressure to act. The Fiona Stanley Hospital was supposed to be a tertiary hospital. It's supposed to, serve the population that's south of the river. If you know anything about Perth, about half the population lives south of the river, half the population lives north of the river, and there wasn't the critical infrastructure needed for medical and hospital services south of the river. So this project was intended to deliver that. And when we talk about the Fiona Stanley Hospital and, being a rich case study in project initiation, one of the reasons the Fiona Stanley case study is so great of a case study is basically it led to a lot of reforms in the way large infrastructure projects are delivered within Western Australia. So it was kind of the first mega project, you could say, in Western Australia on the government's side after the turn of the century. And really that large investment that they made kind of showed that their planning processes and their project initiation processes weren't where they needed to be as a state government and through their state government agencies.
Fantastic. And in terms of the context, I'd agree with, we've learnt a lot of lessons since, 2003, 2004. However, when you're talking about the Reid report, it did actually identify, a big gap in the market of, in Perth, south of the river, there was only Rockingham and Fremantle Hospital at the time, and they needed that extra precinct. And this is what that recommendation came out of. And everyone agreed with it. So, fundamentally, this project had support on all sides of the state government, and it was absolutely genuinely needed. When this started moving, there was also other things happening in the marketplace as well. So Perth was starting to grow substantially with a mining boom at the same time, and there was huge growth, not just in people, but people's expectations of what needs to be available across Perth. So, all of these things were kind of starting to build that pressure, as you were saying. Like there was a lot of pressure coming from different angles. And that led to what we now have, that first initial business case coming out of the state government. Where do you find when you start talking about that first business case that came out of Fiona Stanley, what do you try and highlight to students and people that are listening or talking about this case study?
Yeah, look, I think it's important when I'm talking with students to have them look into who is in the room making decisions and who is giving input, right? So in the case of the Fiona Stanley Hospital, the end users weren't really well represented when they were selecting what was going to be done on the project. So when they were setting the initial scope, poor consultation with doctors and nurses, that would be, the end users, the people actually, providing medical care as to what they needed. There was probably also things were, as you said, Perth was growing rapidly at the time, but also in terms of medical technology, a lot of things were changing quite rapidly with, nuclear imaging and those kinds of things. So trying to, have people who weren't on the front lines, in the hospitals, doctors, nurses, trying to prescribe what would go into this new hospital, it really would have made sense to bring more of the doctors, the nurses on board into the planning stages for what was needed in the hospital when you're setting out, commitments for what it is that you're going to build.
Mm. And while there's a reality to the situation, doctors and nurses are really busy people. That can't always be achieved. And as project management, as professionals, that's part of our job, is to try and find the how to achieve that, to make sure their input is captured, and making sure that we can not just necessarily accelerate, but smooth out their engagement with the project in that planning stage. One of the key questions that have got in this space is how, between they've done their first business case, they've got it out into the public space. The next step was, oh wait, we have to go back and talk to those people because they hadn't been consulted. The question is around time. If you find a step, how long, if you haven't consulted, how long does it normally take for a project to actually engage those stakeholders once they've gone past a certain pace?
Boy, that's a tough question. It's going to depend on the project and the size and the scale of the project. If initially it's some small IT project or something like that, and you can do a quick beta test of the platform that you're creating, you can get it into people's hands and quickly realize, this isn't correct. But as you said, in this case, Fiona Stanley Hospital, you've got doctors and nurses who are going to be the end users, and these are busy people. As the plans started going through, they probably weren't paying very close attention, right? Until, public announcements are made and they say, wait a minute, it's not going to have this, or wait a minute, it's not going to have that. And that raises a flag. So by not having the end users involved in regular consultation from the beginning, takes a lot longer to raise the flag on these issues and to find out that, maybe we didn't properly scope this. Maybe we, rushed planning and the initiation of this project. And in the case of Fiona Stanley, underscoped it initially.
Yeah, and agree. The red flag element, when you're talking about that is, you talk about it takes 4 weeks to get a public announcement out there into the market. Then there's the people take a week to 2 weeks to read and respond. And then, that response then needs to go through the project management receiving, or the project teams receiving of that information, and just consuming that information and digesting it. We're talking 3 months potentially straight up, just by just a straight up element where you potentially could have delayed your project by 3 months by not having that in the initial place. Now, if you think about and compare that to, hey, it would have taken potentially 4 to 5 months to get them engaged in that original consultation. That's the type of thing you're weighing up when you're pushing forward with early initiation stages of business cases and elements. Have you ever found in a similar context where a student or a project that you've been a part of, where they actually did stop and actually, brought in a stakeholder and said, well, hang on, they haven't actually been engaged yet, let's bring them in? And was there a different outcome? Have you ever come across something like that?
Yeah, having had the opportunity to consult on the client side, I got to see a lot more projects than I would have been exposed to if I would have just stayed in construction. If I would have stayed in infrastructure construction, I would do, one project every 3 years. And you'd, basically see it from at the initiation point through to the end. And then you'd be on to your next project. Luckily, in the consultancy space, you're seeing 10 to 15, maybe 20 projects a year coming through that you're contributing to. So yeah, I've seen it a lot where, you're going through the initiation phase and you realize, oh wait, we don't have this, critical engineer's input or this critical end user. We must get them involved. And really, the earlier you can do that, obviously the better, because as you said, with Fiona Stanley, okay, maybe, a public announcement takes, 4 weeks to get there. And then, takes 3 months, when all's said and done, to get the feedback from the end users or the people who are potentially end users. That 3 months, you add that then to the 4 months it's going to take to replan or, rescope the project. That's 8 months. If you would have got those people in the room at the beginning, it's 4 to 5 months, right? So we're really looking at, it's critical to make sure at the beginning when you're setting that vision, you've gone through, as you're making your assumptions about the project, as you're identifying the stakeholders, it's really bringing them in and getting their input before you choose on a select path for the project.
Great. And it sounds easy, doesn't it? It's just like when you're a project manager, it says, "Oh, let's just bring them in and have a discussion." It's not. It's an actual genuine activity that you have to plan, set the agendas, get people booked into calendars, and that is 3 to 4 weeks in advance before the meeting actually happens. Now, if those things aren't done, then you're saying, "Oh, we haven't even sent the agenda to the people, and you want to meet them next week." The things start, deteriorating pretty quickly. We're not saying that happened on Fiona Stanley, but on the flip side, it is just a genuine experience that if you don't have those things set up, it actually delays meaningful information coming into your project. Do you have any key elements that you pass over to students when talking about the initiation of Fiona Stanley?
I wouldn't say any key elements. One of the things we like for them to do is to go into it unbiased. So we're not telling them, "Hey, find this piece of information, tell us what went wrong." We're saying, "What are your thoughts? How do you've read about this now." We have them go back and do, searches of the newspapers for public sentiment at the time, and really force them to go through the project and try and put themselves, in Perth at that time. And for us, it's, when we're talking about initiation, we want them to come to the conclusion and say, "Oh, they should have had, the doctors more involved." And then we talk to them about, well, what would that take? And as you just said, getting the stakeholders in the room, providing an agenda, getting everyone scheduled in the same place, the same time, the critical input. Yeah, that's challenging, but that's your job as a project manager, right? So early on in the project, and not necessarily this project, but a project of this size, whoever's managing the project on the client side really needs to be focused on that. I think in this case, probably a little bit of political pressure forces, like the politician going out into the public and saying, "We're going to do this, we're going to do that." And then you have to go, "Oh, okay." And you're forced to respond. So in, public infrastructure projects, it is more challenging to build in that time and do that, particularly when there's, promises made around election time. It adds that extra challenge in there that you wouldn't face if it was, a private business or the likes.
Well, I slightly disagree there, actually, because, it's very cyclic. Public infrastructure happens, around election cycles. It always has, 4 years in WA, 3 years in federal. And that is a known cycle. We need to, as project managers, take on, if we're going to be in the state government infrastructure space, and our clients are the politicians and the elements of, all the political parties that happen, and they want to achieve things for the patrons of and our residents of West Australia. That in my view is actually part of the stakeholder management. If you're in that state government environment, as a project manager, you need to be aware of when your election cycle is, how to get the correct documentation in front of the authorized person, because that is part of the job. That they need that information to make decisions. And if we're trying to plan to give them the information 2 days before the decision, of course they're not going to be happy. And yes, it's going to be rushed. But if we're saying, well, if they need to make a decision, say, and to have this on the back of an election or for an election, we have the information ready to go in that place. So I actually feel, that it's not just in that private space where you have that, how would you say, consistent approach to, we won't go forward until this happens, until this and all of the ducks are in a row. Project managers need to go, okay, this project's been considered. in the initiation stage, and we need to have that information available. Like, I actually feel that that's now part of a project manager's job as well, is to start bringing in the stakeholder requirements. Now, a key stakeholder requirement for a politician is to have it ready to go so they can promote it at the right time for the cycle of our environment that we have. What do you think about that?
Oh, I agree with what you say. I think we're probably talking about different things in different terms. So, yeah, absolutely, you should be, aware of the election cycle and those kinds of things. But having, obviously looking back at the Fiona Stanley as a case study, when you go back and you read the documentation around it, the team or the folks were kind of hit with the surprise around how quickly it needed to happen. So I think probably a lesson learned there, and that's been probably carried forward now more towards, the MetroNet planning and some of the bigger infrastructure projects that have been delivered around Perth, is, a lessons learned from Fiona Stanley was around, when politicians make announcements, the political cycle, those kinds of things. And probably, I'm guessing, even though it's probably not a policy decision by any of the, bureaucracies, I'm guessing they kind of changed their practices around, okay, we need to be planning ahead of time for what these announcements might be, have the projects more in the pipeline, better planning around what the projects would be, the programs that we're delivering, as opposed to kind of a response to the Reid report, which this was. Not that it caught anyone off guard, but promises were probably, as you read through the case study literature and kind of some of the newspaper clippings from the time, promises were made. And, once those were made, it can be quite tricky if you weren't, aware that those were coming and you hadn't had the experience of delivering these large infrastructure projects, which, again, this one kind of kicked off a string of large infrastructure projects for WA.
I agree. It did. And it's been a fantastic environment ever since. But yeah, totally agree. So my next question is around Fiona Stanley herself. So we've talked about the stakeholder engagement and all of those elements. Now, what did that mean in terms of the outcome from the business case? At what point do you think the project team that was involved with Fiona Stanley actually got the right business case across the line?
Oh, look, after the initial announcements and the proclamations around 420 million, and looking back through some of the newspaper clippings and things like that from the time, pretty quickly they realized that, hey, we didn't scope this thing correctly. And they almost had to do a second initiation. They basically did do a second initiation of the project moving towards 2007 when they finally, came up with the price of a 1.7 some billion, I think was the announcement at that time. It's pretty quick. And the second time around, they realized we have to get everybody on board. We need to take our time and we need to get this right.
Agreed. And if you look into the information that's available, they actually, talk about having the clinical services review through 2006 and finishing in 2007, and identifying the actual infrastructure they needed was, an increase of 40% in just terms of space alone. So when we're not even talking about technology or infrastructure, just general hectares of space, when you see stuff like that happening in a project, what's the outcome in the end? What do you see?
Well, I mean, one of the things for people who aren't familiar with construction or infrastructure projects is when you see, a gap like that, 40% increase in services that were required, you think, well, all that planning that occurred up to that point, not that it's moot, but it's not as valuable as you thought it was, because you're suddenly having to account for this whole other 40% of clinical services and all the associated, services that go with those. You're really, replanning the project at that stage. Unfortunately, you've probably already made some commitments. There's, some people who say, well, we really wanted this, and, we stick to the original idea. At some points, you almost think, when you're reading this case study, should they have just started over from scratch and, scrap every design up to that point and say, all right, let's start completely over, right? They didn't do that. But, you kind of question when you're reading it, would that have been the right approach?
No, well, I agree. And, they've made an approach, and we now have a Fiona Stanley Hospital. But one of the key things that I see that happened, in that period is we had a huge boom here in Perth. But two, in the project management space, a new tool came available. And it was the AACE's classification system for cost estimation. And while it wasn't readily utilized across the industry as it is now, this is something that was new and was coming into project management during this time. What's your dealing in that space, in the cost estimation space?
Yeah, look, from an outsider looking in on this project, it seems as though bringing in the AACE guidelines really helped to get control of the scope as well as to manage the risk on the project. It certainly reduced the uncertainty around the cost in the project. But not really being a cost planner myself, I'm not as dialed into it, I believe, as you probably would be.
No, yeah, fair call, fair call. While I find that in projects, a lot of people still really don't like that early stage classification of, if you're in a concept design, add 60%. Not many people like that particular classification. But once you start getting into your planning stages or even later initiation stages with a better concept, say potentially in infrastructure speak, we go to 30% usually is what you base your business case on. That type of information, you have a substantial drop in potential classification percentages. And the approach now is a lot more refined. But back then it was, broad brush, just add certain percentages. And you can actually see that, to support this conversation, you will have the links below you'll see that there's the Auditor General's report, the Reed report, links to those locations. So you can actually see this information, but you can actually see this at work in one of those tables where we can see from 2004 to 2008, where you have a nice table where you can see the cost estimation of 2004 versus the final cost estimation in 2008, post all of the things that we've been talking about. And one of the key tools that came into play later is that classification system. And if you're not familiar with that in that initiation stage, I would strongly recommend going and learning a bit about that. Learning about the Risk Engineering Society's guidelines to applying both inherent and contingent risks in estimation. Because those key elements, AACE's, Engineering Australia's, all work within the ISO 31,000, risk management activities, as well as the International Standards for Project Management. All of those things are now available tools for project managers to be, as I call it, is a project manager's never right. We're just less wrong. It's a good way to look at it. So use these things to be less wrong in your job as you try and forecast the future, because we consistently ask for a crystal ball. It's all we can be is less wrong. We're not talking about being right. We're actually less wrong in this space. Have you ever come across a similar situation where cost estimation potentially, because the classification has actually stopped a project going ahead, in terms of that?
No, I haven't been across one where the project was actually, stopped because of that. I do think, though, as you were talking previously about, bringing in the cost classifications and talking about, at a concept at 60%, at this phase at 30%, it made me think, I was trying to put myself in Perth at that time. I bet, while the cost classifications, they help and they work to reduce risk, I bet it was pretty unpopular at the time because a lot of people see that as, oh, we're committing that money now. That can't be used elsewhere, right? And in reality, it's, well, we're ensuring that this project gets done and we're going to see this project through. But, if I'm a competing bureaucracy, let's say on main roads or something, that's competing for that same pool of funds from the state government, and I see them saying, well, we're going to apply 60% in this case, and you're going. But in reality, it's because you need that to fill the scope in and account for that scope that hasn't been defined yet. So that's why we're adding that on top. But I would imagine that being something new and novel that was being brought in at that time, there was probably some resistance from elsewhere in government.
Well, absolutely. And when you demonstrating value in this space, because that's what you're trying to do, is to demonstrate the value of why are we putting this money aside here and now, is purely to say, hey, well, you'll have less troubles re-ask, you'll be asking for money again in 24 months, and then asking money again 12 months after that, and asking for money again 12 months after that. You essentially, do you rip the Band-Aid off now and have that, larger number up front, or do you constantly go back and ask? The value is a bit of a, sometimes it is easier to go back and get some more money depending on the size of your project. So like, bus stop around the corner, sometimes it is just you go back and ask for a little bit more money. But on the other side, when you got a Fiona Stanley, the size of and the precinct that they established, it was a big change in approach to that.
The size of the project lends itself to using the cost classification. I mean, if you think about going back to the government, let's say, okay, now we're saying it's 1 billion, right? And we say, a year later, well, we need 1.7. That's not a good look for the people planning it, for the contractors involved. General public's probably going, what is this rort? We're being ripped off. They said they were doing it for this much. What's going on? So getting it right on these big public infrastructure projects from the beginning, I think, obviously the AAC classifications certainly helped to allow for that, build that room in the budget to then make sure you got the things right at that point. And based off the case study and the literature I've read, it seemed like after the introduction, from there on, they did a lot better job capturing the scope of just keeping it within that forecast.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to touch on just before we move on is the escalation that was put aside within this project. Now, if you jump into this case study, you'll actually see a really large escalation. Now, that escalation was there at the time because in 2007, we in Perth had the biggest growth ever experienced. It was never experienced before, and it was upwards of greater than 20% increase in that 1 year alone. Preceded immediately straight after by the GFC in 2008, which because of the growth in 2007, we didn't really feel as much in Perth here. But I know you weren't in Australia at that time, but the 2008 period. What did you see in the study from your perspective that led to that large escalation figure?
When you talk about projects and talk about risk versus uncertainty, right? Risk is something that you can put a probability to. It's something that it's either going to happen or it's not, or it's going to happen to this degree. Uncertainty talks more about the unknowns, right? So at that time, there was that uncertainty around the market, what's happening with the GFC, what's happening global. There's these shocks coming that, when you're planning for a project like that, and, if you put you and I in a room together and we were planning for that project at that time, we probably wouldn't have thought, twice about, there's going to be a collapse in the credit markets in the US, and that's going to, sink all the projects globally. So, my experience with the GFC was probably a lot different than what happened in Perth. I worked in a heavy civil firm at that time, building roads and bridges. All the projects in the US were being canceled at that time. So it was a real fearful time that projects were being canceled. When I first read the Fiona Stanley case study and the 2010 auditor's report, I believe, I remember thinking, wow, if that would have been back in the US at that time, that project would have been canned. It would have never got off the ground. So kudos to Perth for, really seeing through. I mean, it was a critical piece of infrastructure for the public, the medical services and everything that it provides, getting that project across the line. Now, obviously having that escalation number in there probably helped to keep the project moving forward.
Absolutely.
In that, there's probably less fear around it. You're probably more tuned having lived here in Perth during that time, though. I don't know that the level of fear in public infrastructure and government projects was as high here as it was back in the US.
No, it definitely wasn't. Not from my perspective, though. My perspective was a lot younger than I am now, especially around the fact that I hadn't finished my first undergrad degree at that time, and I was the only thing I saw was that people stopped being employed straight out of university. So all of a sudden, if you were 2 years into a uni course, you were actually being employed right there and then, but you actually had to finish a uni degree by the end of 2008 to actually score a job. So there was changes in the market, but probably nothing felt like what you would have experienced back in overseas.
No, look, going back to the Fiona Stanley project, was the final announcement on the price that they're moving ahead with was 2007.
Yeah.
So yeah, right before, maybe it's because they got it out right before the bottom fell out in 2008.
Yeah, and timing is half the battle with projects sometimes.
Yep.
It's better to be lucky, and I think in this case, we were 1 year lucky on the right side of potential elements coming in and playing. So I want to move into lessons learned. Some things that the project managers can take. So we've already talked about some of them, and there's the applying the classification system and the uncertainty elements. What are some of the other things that project managers who are either in their program, like well and truly into their career, or those that are starting, really take from this case study?
Oh, look, I've probably emphasized this already. The number one thing for me in the classroom when we're talking to early career PMs is around that stakeholder engagement, and that, stakeholder involvement happens from the start, happens during initiation. Get the people who are going to be using the thing in the room, get their feedback, their input. What does the product need to do to be useful for them, right? So really getting those benefits right. In public works projects, you have politicians and bureaucrats who are selecting the benefits for the public, right? Not an easy task because the public has varied opinions, different wants and needs. So, in the case of this project, probably being, a bit more consultative, obviously, with the end users, the doctors, nurses. I think other takeaways from this case study is the initiation process. While you want to choose the right things that you're going to be doing, right? It might end in a business case and you approve the project and you start moving forward. But what it seemed was, even though they got the project back on track with the second planning going into 2007, there was kind of still an idea that they were going to execute the project while they were still planning some of the outcomes, like the IT requirements for the project. Those were evolving, and at a time when digital technologies were rapidly evolving. I mean, these things, decisions being made in 2007 and commitments being made around the electronic records management systems, that's going to be quite a bit different in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, as you go on down the line for when Fiona Stanley Hospital was going to start operating. So having that parallel planning process, it can be challenging in that you're putting physical infrastructure in place and you don't have a full understanding of the requirements of how that physical infrastructure is going to be used. Even though they did the correct thing in, replanning the project, coming up with the right cost structure, the decisions to, start executing the project when you didn't have a full understanding of the workforce requirements, some of those kinds of things, added a bit of risk back into the project.
Absolutely. And acknowledging the uncertainty around IT infrastructure and how much that changes so quickly is now a key part of project management. Whether you're in the IT sector, infrastructure, or any space, really is there is an IT element to every project, and being able to manage, say, if you've got a 6-year program, the IT you're using at the beginning of that program is not going to be the same IT you're using at the end of that program. Look at what's happened the last 2.5 years. 2.5 years ago, we didn't have AI. 2.5 years later, not only do we have AI, we've actually got a very capable AI starting to change the marketplace as we see it. Topic for another episode.
That's your next episode.
Though, in terms of, I guess, context, one of the things that I think, we need to really pull as a lesson learned is being aware of the uncertainty, and being okay to not just, manage that uncertainty, but to acknowledge that it's there. Make sure that it's captured not just in your risk register, in your reporting, and in people's understanding of those risks that are available or that are potentially going to impact your project. Those key elements is one of the key lessons learned out of this one. And one of the things that have fundamentally changed in state government is the ability to manage and implement risks throughout projects. Now, project risk you're really close to home for me. It's something that I can talk about for hours and hours. I'm not going to bore everyone and put everyone to sleep today, but in terms of risk management activities, they are very useful depending on what size of your project, and how you apply it. It can be dovetailed to be applied to a project that's small or large. And, using the engineering, Australia's risk engineering society's guidelines can definitely help in that space. A lesson learned that I think a lot of project managers need to take is actually bring that and start applying the different opportunities that are available for that project. Initiation is the selection of your frameworks of delivery as well. So in terms of the context, I see there's a lot more selecting of how you want to approach risk, how you want to approach costs, how you want to approach your design progressing, or your IT structure, infrastructure, all of those elements. The decision on the process is usually in initiation. The process building is usually in that planning stage. So don't ignore the fact that you have to make some decisions in the initiation stage. And I think that is a key lesson learned here in this Fiona Stanley case.
Yeah. And I think that carries through to what the state government has done, right? So they changed their governance frameworks after, pre-Fiona Stanley and post-Fiona Stanley with a lot of the lessons learned there. Now, you're prescribing things like risk management frameworks, that you're going to be bringing into projects ahead of time during the project initiation phase and following, set out guidelines and policies that have now been inbuilt into the way that the Western Australia state government approaches projects.
Absolutely. And, in terms of when we talk about, all these things that potentially can come together in that initiation stage, this is just the first stage of a project lifecycle. There's many more hours and potentially years that can go in post this work. So, Perth is a small town. PM is even smaller in the small town. When you hand over to another stage or you've done your initiation, people will pick up your work and try and work off it. So make sure you're always putting your best foot forward as well.
Yeah, you want to make it as easy for them to pick up the project and run with it as possible, right? So I always tell students, and I emphasize this, it's, during the initiation and the planning phases of projects, don't look at it as overhead, right? It's contributing to the project. It's progress. It is, I believe you were saying that earlier. I really, if you go back to when I started in projects, I used to have bosses that would say like, planning's overhead, it's get out there and start doing work. They'll show progress, but really, it's getting it right up front, putting in that time and effort. It is making progress. It's not overhead on the project. And, if you are involved in those phases, you want everyone down the line to be able to pick this project up and run with it. It's just like at the end of the project, when you're handing off the deliverable, to the Department of Health and saying, all right, you now need to operate this. Well, you want them to have an asset that they can then operate, they can pick up and run with, rather than, just okay, we're done. Now it's your turn. You need to look at the initiation process the same way. It's a continuous process. It's it's a planning, it's leading in, it's making the right decision. But, if you're only involved in that stage, other people are going to pick it up and they need to go through that life cycle. So really making sure that they get out to a good start on the best foot possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having such an awesome chat about Fiona Stanley and the initiation stage of the life cycle. In terms of we're launching this podcast in October. What are some of the things that you'll be doing in October? They're going to keep you busy.
Boy, it's obviously student related things. Semester's not over yet. We're putting in a few tenders for work. Creating project management practices overseas, working with developing nations. So really hoping to land a few of those and get out there beyond Perth and kind of, share some of the lessons learned, like from Fiona Stanley with our neighbors kind of here in the Indo-Pacific region.
Oh, that's fantastic. And, I'll be probably based a bit more local. I'll be showing up to the PMI a monthly meeting on the 8th of October. But also I'm launching a bit of an informal social mid-month Wednesday night catch up. It's the Scope Creep Social. I'm going to name it. I'll be putting it out there as well. So people, I know it's a bit of a fine play on words. I like doing that across project management quite a lot. but essentially it's just a bit of an informal social where people can come together, and we'll just get together and talk about PMs and what some of the things that are happening in your world. If you need a hand or anything, it'll be location to be confirmed, but it'll be on Wednesday the 15th of October, probably after 5 p.m. sometime in the CBD. Nice and close for public transport users to utilize. But overall, this is the end of the first episode of a series that I hope to take into the future. So, Brad, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for everything you've brought to the conversation today, and the continued support in the background with project management. It is fantastic to work with you, alongside you, and and seeing where the students can get to. We've been working together since 2016 almost, sort of. And we've helped a lot of people move into the project management profession, and plan to help a lot more to come forward. The next episode, we will be talking about the planning stage. I don't have a case study locked down yet for that episode, but I definitely will be sharing that as we get the speaker and the project locked down. So I hope to bring in a new case study. Don't want to follow one case study the whole way through a life cycle. I'll change projects at each stage, and we'll talk about something different each time. But Brad, thank you for coming. Any final comments before we close?
Oh, thanks for having me. Always appreciated everything you've done for our students, helping them to launch their careers through the initiatives you've headed up. Maybe a suggestion on a good case study. So the Sydney South SLER, Southeastern Light Rail SELR,
Yep.
project is a good one in planning. So you maybe gloss through that one and see if it fits your needs.
Absolutely. And I do have that on the list. I have a very long list of case studies that I've looked into over the years. That is definitely on the list. And we'll be hitting that at some point in the near future. Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you again for tuning in. Again, it's been a bit of a journey to get here to the end of the first episode. Happy to have that conversation, how we got here, where we're up to, and all of those elements and what's coming up forward. But please, if you ever are interested in talking more about project management, risk management, or just generally about projects across Perth, West Australia, or Australia, I'm always keen for a coffee and a chat. Thank you for listening and watching. This is Projects in Focus, and we're finishing up. Thank you.